So this afternoon we're going to talk a bit about overconsumption, and the title is What We Can Do and What Can Be Done. We have a great group of experts here. The idea of obtaining a better balance between consumption and sustainability and production. And this will be with mining, textile industry, agriculture, and other things. So we'll start the discussion. So let me introduce my colleagues here. Susan Golicic, very good, Department Chair and Professor of Department of Management. Susan's research focuses on sustainability and relationships in the global supply chain. She has several years of professional experience in logistics and environmental engineering and has consulted with numerous firms on the supply chain and management issues, which are highly relevant today. Next, Joe Scalia IV. Joe is an associate professor in the Department of Civil Engineering, specializes in geo-environmental and geotechnical engineering. Dr. Scalia's research and teaching center on the convergences of soil mechanics with contaminant hydrology, geology, environmental engineering, hydrology, mechanical engineering, and hydraulics. Next, we have my colleague Meagan Schipanski, an associate professor in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences. Her research focuses on understanding how plant-soil interactions mediate nutrient cycling, putting this research in the broader context of social and economic context. Meagan's research is focused on sustainability in food production, as agriculture contributes both a substantial amount to the global change issues, looking at increased climate variability, its impact on agriculture, and developing resilient and regionally adapted production systems. So thank you, Meagan, for being here. And finally, my colleague Terry Yan, professor in the Department of Design and Merchandising. Research interests include promoting consumer sustainable lifestyles, sustainability in clothing practices and education. Her teaching themes discuss sustainability and social responsibility in apparel industry regarding manufacturing, distribution, retailing, and product promotion. So welcome all of you. And we'll start just briefly with maybe some intro remarks from each of you. We'll go left to right. Susan, would you mind starting off just telling us about what you work on and some of the things that are happening right now?
Sure, thank you. And thanks for being here on this great weather day we're having. So I'm a professor of supply chain management in the Department of Management, and a lot of my research focuses on environmental and social sustainability within the supply chain. A very pertinent and increasingly important topic within supply chain management, so that for me personally was really good to see that the industry is moving in that way. I don't do anything in a specific industry vertical, such as apparel or mining or anything. My research kind of stretches across multiple industries. But a couple of things that I've noticed as of late, due to things happening in the supply chain as well as what we've been facing globally in the world, some of my research is starting to branch into consumers as part of the supply chain and how that's impacting decisions in the supply chain. And so some things I noticed with respect to overconsumption and what we can do, there's some positives and negatives. And with respect to the supply chain in general, one of the positive things that's happening is over the last several years, businesses have been working really hard on what they call the circular supply chain, so that there's no cradle to grave, it's cradle to cradle. If there's waste, can we turn it into a new raw material? So the idea that we're not going to be consuming new natural resources, but just recycling, reusing, remanufacturing current ones. Supply chains are doing that because it's less expensive to supply those materials that way. And so that's something they've been moving toward, which is a very positive thing. However, on the flip side, negatively, I'm sure we all, because we're all consumers, so we all know things that we'd like to have aren't available right now because of huge delays in the supply chain with respect to manufacturing, sourcing, delivery, etc. And so what's happening is those delays are causing the supply chain to make unsustainable decisions in that we need to transport more, we need to transport faster, we need to use more diesel. And so that is happening a great deal in the supply chain. So there's some pluses and minuses, and we're hoping that by the time we get to 2023, some of this will have worked itself out and we will have gotten back where supply chains are functioning a little bit better. A big positive is that the rail industry did not go on strike, because that is a much more sustainable mode of transport.
Right.
And so at least that is still there, instead of having to turn everything back onto trucks if the railway isn't running. On the consumer side, one of the positives is that I've recently done some research, and consumers are saying things like, because things weren't available, it really caused me to think about what I buy, what I really need, how I get it. Do I need to purchase certain things, or can I not purchase those things? And so consumers are being a little bit more intentional about how they purchase things, which is making them purchase things in a more sustainable way, often. But on the negative side, consumer choices are also having a rough impact, because certain things they're wanting to purchase require new natural resources. So there's a big push, right, across the country, certain states and so forth, buy more electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are fantastic, but electric vehicles require a lot of minerals, rare earth materials, et cetera, to put together the batteries to actually run those vehicles. And we don't have a very effective means yet of recycling those materials and so forth. And so we want more sustainability, but sometimes that's also going to have a different effect. So it's that interesting trade-off of, do we feel good about what we're purchasing, knowing that maybe in the long run there might be some adverse effects as well? So those are some of the things that I've seen going on lately, and so it's a really interesting time to be researching in the area of sustainability because of what's going on.
Great, thank you. That was great. Joe.
That may be a perfect lead-in. I guess I should start with, my name is Joe Scalia in civil and environmental engineering. I should probably also say I'm a consumer. I guess that's the blanket starting statement.
Everybody has to say that. Yeah, right.
I admit it. I have a 3- and a 5-year-old. They are definitely consumers. But maybe to the immediate preceding comments, I work primarily on the waste side of what we consume. So my 2 major areas, I'm one of the founders and the CSU site director for a group called the Tailing Center, which is an industry university cooperative research center related to mine waste and mine waste stewardship. So I'm happy to talk about the extractive side of metals and rare earths and the tremendous ramifications that has, and the tremendous scale that we don't think about that underlies, all the components in your cell phone, or to get those electric cars. We're not going to get all the Teslas that the undergrads imagine when they go out and are going to have as their first car by recycling the old Teslas.
Right.
I was horrified recently to learn that a Ford F-150 Lightning, which is sold out for years, weighs a ton more than a conventional F-150.
Wow, doesn't make sense.
Which is all those battery components that have to come out of the ground. They're not coming from recycling old electric cars.
Wow.
And so we work with industry, with regulators on training, but also on how do we manage mine waste. And that field has been very rapidly advancing over the last few years. If you've seen in the news, there was a big mine waste failure in South Africa 2 weekends ago. That we've been having big mine waste failures almost annually for the last decade. They go back further than that. The mining industry all of a sudden has started caring about mine waste, not magically, but because their investors and their insurers came to them and said, if you don't start becoming environmental stewards with your waste, we're going to stop investing in you, we're going to stop insuring you, and mining is incredibly capital intensive.
Wow.
So happy to talk about that. And then maybe the other part of what I do in civil and environmental, I'm the director for the Center for Contaminant Hydrology at CSU. So we deal with groundwater and soil remediation from past extractives. It may not surprise you that chemical manufacturers, oil and gas companies have had huge impacts to groundwater and the environment. I know, shocking. And it turns out it's really hard to undo those impacts. And so what we try to do is teach engineers to prevent those and to really understand how that works and the consequence of what happens when they fail to prevent those, but also work to clean up and restore impacts.
Great. That's great. Okay. Meagan, you want to take it? Yeah.
Sure. So I eat. There you go. So I am in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences, and I am an agroecosystem ecologist, a cropping systems agronomist. Depends on who I'm talking to often. But our research largely focuses on what we grow, how we grow it, and what the impacts are on ecosystem carbon, nitrogen, and water dynamics. So we recently finished a large project focused on water conservation in the Ogallala or High Plains aquifer region that touches 8 different states across the central U.S. And I'm sure everyone's heard that this year has been a painfully dry year for the Colorado River, so that's been forefront of thinking. So I think one of the main things in terms of, in agriculture, this idea of overconsumption is also plagued with the concept of underconsumption and scarcity. And so I think it's always this challenge to challenge the assumptions about producing more and more, because there are in some places where food insecurity is a real thing. And sometimes it's about abundance, but oftentimes it's distribution and supply chain issues. And so some of the things that concern me that I try to, especially in teaching, help students think about is, we hear, well, by 2050, we have to have this much production. Those are based on assumptions that everything continues as status quo. And so I think what we're trying to do is say, all right, that's a projection, just like a climate change projection. Are there things we can do so we don't actually get to that point? Because that still includes a huge amount of waste and loss along the process and lack of conservation impacts. It's impacted by what we grow, what we eat, who we feed what we grow to, and how it's used, and the resources that go into that. And so a lot of what we've been talking about is in agriculture, there's conversation about efficiency. Efficiency, and that's almost always efficiency per unit of production. So if we keep increasing production, which is definitely has some benefits, we will, even with increased conservation or efficiency, we might continue to use more and more resources. So part of what we've been doing looking at the Ogallala Aquifer, which is not a renewable resource for most of the region, is how do we tie that efficiency to actual net conservation gains, for example? And how do we look at the excitement about emerging carbon markets in ways that also support other co-benefits? And so trying to think about landscapes and agricultural landscapes as providing multiple functions. So I think
Great.
I'll stop there.
That's super. Okay, Terry?
Hi, everyone. Terry Yan from Department of Design Merchandising. So I'm a consumer, and I study sustainability from consumer perspective. I wanted to talk a little bit about my kind of research for the last 10 years, how I started my sustainability-related focus. The first sustainability-related project I did was to understand consumer recycling intention, because coming from Taiwan, where recycling was mandated, so when I was at the University of Arizona as a grad student and coming to CSU 16 years ago, I was so surprised about recycling was really scarce. So that kind of triggered my interest in studying recycling behavior. At the similar time, I started to think about secondhand shopping. Again, similarly back at home, so we did not consider using used goods from people we didn't know as something that we would, like it's a taboo. We would not use something that from another person that we didn't know about. So usually using secondhand was not really something that's common. So when I came here seeing our Goodwill, Salvation Army, it was really intriguing to me why people would shop secondhand. So anyways, I started those projects. That was at the beginning of my sustainability journey. So starting in 2016, I think with the SoGES GCRT grant and the sustainability funding from CSU, my colleague and I started to really conduct research about looking at sustainability in the apparel industry. So with those fundings, we did a lot of different promotional events on campus and in the Fort Collins community to really want to engage consumers to think about how they can consume clothing more sustainably. So we did clothing swaps, we did Mandy Cafe on campus and also in the city. So the goal really is to promote awareness of sustainability and how it's related to clothing, what we buy, and how we consume. So I guess so far, after sort of 10 years of studying sustainability from the consumer perspective, my take on this subject is the more I study sustainability in the apparel industry especially, the more I feel like it's so complex for the whole, to the whole system, and the more challenging it is to really address sustainability. I'm saying it not because we should not continue to address this issue, but I'm saying that we should be more patient. And we should not be expecting like a speedy recovery or speedy change over time. We should just be patient and really try our best to do one thing at a time. So with that said, I hope that I know today's topic is overconsumption, but I hope that we will have some time to also address overproduction, because that's sort of the other side. We talk about demand, but we also need to talk about the supply. Right. Why we are consuming so much, because the industry continue to provide us, especially the fast fashion, the low quality, inexpensive clothing that we can buy on a regular basis. So back, say, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, the apparel companies, they roll out new styles about 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes 10 weeks regularly. But nowadays, some fast fashion companies, they can roll out new styles every 2 weeks. So with that kind of fashion changes, especially for younger consumers, they really want to continue to buy, to look different, to look new. Right. Especially they want to post something on Facebook. They don't do Facebook, I don't think. They do Instagram, they do other TikTok. They want to look different every time they are on social media. So that, I think, is part of the reason why we are over-consuming. But it's also because the industry feeds us the tremendous products, looking great, looking good. This color I don't have at home. I don't have this pink, but I don't have that green color, so I want to buy. So a lot of those, especially apparel consumption, is very hedonic driven, and I think that's part of the reason why overconsumption is so kind of significant in the clothing side of things.
That's great.
So I guess I'll just stop here.
So, like, how often do people recycle clothes?
So, well, based on research, about 15% of the clothing that has been made is estimated to be recycled or reused. Right. So about 70, 80% of those will go to landfill. Right. And depending on the materials of the clothing, a lot of those, they might not be biodegradable until 200 years later. Right. So that usually is causing problem. And going back to the waste management and how the overconsumption, the amount of waste that we actually bring to landfill, that's really a big issue too.
Okay, this is going to be great. Okay, anybody have any questions? Because I got like 1,000 of them coming. Somebody want to step up? Here we go. Okay, and you can say your name, and if you'd like to plug a business or something, you're allowed to do that. Your name would be enough, though.
Sure. I'm Rick Casey. I teach environmental economics at Front Range, and I'm sure you've all seen that video, Story of Stuff. Yep. And one of the startling things I learned that when I first saw that about 10 years ago is that for every bag or barrel of trash we put out on the street to get picked up, it took 70 barrels of trash to make that. So I think, what would the panelists comment on changing our manufacturing processes to lessen our impact on the environment?
Okay. So from a manufacturing perspective, anybody want to step up? You can all take a turn. Go.
So I'll give a little bit of an answer to that. I actually use the Story of Stuff in my supply chain intro
So what
classes.
is Stuff again? Is it a documentary or something? Or what is it?
Yeah, it's this woman named Annie. She started this, and she's got videos of different industries. She started with a basic one, and then she's got different industry videos that basically to educate. Educate with a definite message, though. Mm-hmm. She's very adamant about how she tells the story. But,
okay, sorry about that. Go.
But anyway, that's an interesting question because you're correct. In making products, there's a lot of waste in purchasing the materials and the packaging that goes along with it. And there's anywhere from 30 to 35% of all of our waste is packaging. And so all along the supply chain, as things move to manufacturing and out of manufacturing, we've got all these numerous waste streams coming out, water and different things depending on what the product is made of and how it's made. There are some companies that are really working hard at that. And that really kind of comes down to the orientation and the belief system of the upper management of the individual companies. If they really believe in sustainability, then they'll start to make changes to reduce the amount of waste, reduce the packaging that goes through, try to make sure they're getting the materials in the form that they need it right away, as opposed to getting it in and having to transform it into something else to use it and so forth. So some companies are really good at it. They're setting great goals. They're reducing the waste through their whole stream, or they're finding another way to use the waste, whether they're selling it as a raw material or reusing it themselves, et cetera. And so the companies that are really good at it are really good at it, and the companies that aren't really are bad. And like I said, it comes down to the management philosophy. If a company believes in it, they're going to put processes and policies in place. If they don't, they won't. And one of the things that we try to do in research is convince companies, right? We're going to tell them, here's why you should make this decision, because it's going to save you money. Because that ultimately is what speaks to companies, even if they're not publicly traded, even if they're a nonprofit. They have to make a certain amount of money to stay in business. And so if we can convince them that if you reduce the amount of products, if you reduce the amount of materials you are using in your products, if you design it differently, if you don't have as much waste, you will save money. And that's what we really need to start helping companies understand, is that sustainability pays. It doesn't cost you. It may cost you a little bit up front, but eventually it pays.
Right. Joe, you were...
I was just going to add, maybe on the landfill or the municipal solid waste landfill side first. I think another big problem there is we don't really pay the true cost of disposing of our waste. And so those externalities related to impacts to the atmosphere, related to impacts to groundwater, every landfill leaks. They're designed to leak. We've got a criterion from the EPA on they can leak this rate. And so as that gets realized, and as landfills, which are designed for 30 years, go past that 30-year time horizon, and we realize, oh no, we're going to be managing these truly in perpetuity, and that costs a lot of money to design something for perpetuity as opposed to 30 years. There'll hopefully be drivers on the waste side as well. Maybe the other piece, though, on mining, I think we don't even take into account often the waste component from mining that goes into products, because it's really a different form of waste. And copper is a great example, because we use copper in wires for our homes and solar panels and wind turbines and electric cars. A good grade of copper today is 3%, which means we're generating 97% waste. A bad grade of copper that's still being mined is maybe 0.5% or less than 0.5%.
So is that in the tailings? Is that still, is that what's left behind? Is that what you're talking about?
So that's the ore that's being mined, that how much copper we get by mass out of that ore.
It's 3%.
So mining is really good at breaking up rocks, right? Mining is basically an industry for making rocks into smaller rocks. And so the vast majority of those smaller rocks are mine waste, are tailings that need to get stored, and they need to get stored forever. It's not like those smaller rocks we created are going away. And so there's copper manufacturers that are mining 300,000 tons of rock a day to produce copper, which is kind of an unfathomably large amount of rock, right? 300,000 tons would be like 150,000, back to my F-150 analogy, 150,000 F-150s by mass per day.
Wow.
Just for copper. And so the amount of waste that then needs to be stored forever. But maybe on the other side of the overconsumption panel, I'll just say, I'm probably going to end up saying at some point, so I'll say it now, my opinion would be we need more mining. even in this overconsumption conversation. So maybe a future question, we can come back to that.
Okay, that sounds great. Anybody else want to comment on that first question? Go ahead.
So kind of going
Sorry.
back to the overproduction, there are some reasons why apparel manufacturers will have to kind of overproduce. One is a lot of times it's hard to make accurate market demand. So if the prediction is not accurate about how much consumers are buying, especially now with social media and how the fashion trends change so fast, it's just hard for them to be on point to know exactly how much they should produce based on what consumers are looking for and buying. The other thing is a lot of times the retailers, they might not have trust in what the suppliers can do. They might worry that the suppliers might not ship certain amount of products in time, so they really would like to order an extra just in case maybe one supplier cannot provide this amount, but at least another supplier can give me a certain amount for me to sell at the store. So of course then we overproduction also in terms of the economy of scale, how if you have large production that it will be cheaper, and then that means that even if the apparel retailers bring it down to like discounted price, they can still make a profit. So if you think about the reasoning, that's also kind of all contributed to overproduction.
Okay. Any other questions yet? Follow up. Anybody? Okay, I have a question. So Terry, I was going to ask you. So you talk about this overproduction thing, right? This idea, and what about like textile people that are sort of what they say? So I talk to a lot of ag people like Meagan, and they're all talking about sustainability, and the ag people always go, "Oh, those textile guys, man, they're the worst." Right? And the textile guys are pointing at the ag people saying, "Oh, those ag people are the worst." But the hit on some of the textile things, they're trying to get into these new sources of materials. So the bioeconomy now, right? A lot of people using materials to build clothes that like hemp. I'm just using hemp as an example, but there are others, right? So you maybe comment on that? Like what is the sort of, is there a trend going toward that? Like this idea of using more regenerative materials or sustainable materials?
Right, so from I'm not a textile scientist, but I can say from kind of my general understanding. Yeah. So the textile science industry in general is very innovative. So they have been trying to be more sustainable by really focusing on how they can utilize more natural fiber, or how they can recycle more polyester, or to really bring the next level of the materials to use that could be more sustainable. But a lot of them, depending on the function or the specific use of the garments, even though the textile itself might be sustainable, but sometimes we have to add the chemical, the layers, they might not be sustainable. So that's also kind of an issue. So you have one side that is really trying very hard to be sustainable, but then to meet consumers' use and functional purposes, then there's a lot of things that are also going into the products that might not be very sustainable. Right.
So in terms of like contaminants or something, right? In other words, you're saying like dyes and stuff like that, right? Okay. All right, cool. Questions? Guys, this can't be my show all day, but I can answer questions. Anybody got a question or comment for the panel? Okay, I have another one. Okay, so Joe, I was going to ask you a question. So I had read this thing about the inefficiencies in the mining industry, and that, for example, in places like Arizona, and I don't know if this is still relevant, the remining of tailings, like this idea of going into places that were mined previously and reusing that material. And I was wondering, is that important, or is that what's the premise behind that? I mean, is it cheaper to do that than to do mining, or what?
Oh, cheaper is a good question. So the concept of remining is that we've got literally hundreds of thousands of legacy mine waste sites in the western United States.
Right.
And historically, these were mined often by hand, but even more recently, using processes that we've advanced beyond. And so we're able to extract either concentrations out of mine waste at rates that's far in excess of what it was 10 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, let alone 150 years ago. But also, we now are aware that we need different elements that co-occur in those ores that we weren't originally going after. So we might have, mine waste that was just mined for silver, and it has all sorts of other elements that we want now for cell phones and other technology. The huge issue there is the scale of mine waste, and also just getting access to remine it. And so if you imagine as a company, you don't want to take on those old liabilities from what people did in the past. Mm-hmm. You don't have records of it. You don't know what's there.
Right.
And so there's a huge gamble at play in remining. And the other piece is the scale now of big industrial mines is massive, and a lot of this mine waste is distributed in pretty small pockets. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit of a different process than how we've historically kind of moved towards larger commercialization of mining. At the same time, there's a tremendous opportunity to take waste that is contributing to acid rock drainage, contributing to other environmental impacts that is potentially unstable, and go back in and remine it and stabilize it and then place it in a manner and restore it in a manner that we're actually happy with the outcome of the mine waste, as opposed to much of the mine waste in Colorado, for example, is just sitting there orphaned, reacting with the environment, and we're not happy about the situation. So.
Wow. Okay. Question. Here we go. We'll do two. Let me get Peter first, and I'll get you. Here, Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Bachland from SoGES. This is for any and all of the panelists. Are there any examples of products or material where the entire demand is satisfied through recycling? Or where it could be, even in principle, within reach? Or is this always just kind of affecting the problem at the margins, but we still fundamentally just need to keep mining and growing to get the raw material we need?
That's like a hard question. Go ahead, Sue.
Actually, it's a really great question,
Yeah.
but I don't know of a single product where that is possible now. It'd be wonderful if we get there. We do a lot of work with Ball Corp in our program. And of course, they have huge sustainability programs, and they're working very hard to replace plastic with aluminum. Whether it be the cups at arenas for beer, sodas, etc., they're introducing that. They can't produce their products fast enough. They don't have they've built new manufacturing plants, etc. They've taken on some of the recycling themselves, so they're collecting aluminum, they're trying to recycle it, and they just cannot keep up with the demand for cans as well as those aluminum cups, as it is, period. And so they're struggling with trying to manufacture, trying to recycle, trying to control that. They'd love for it to be completely circular, where they get all the aluminum back and they just produce the new aluminum. But because the demand is so high, they have to purchase virgin aluminum also. So, and they actually, and that's much more expensive than the recycled aluminum. But that's the only one I know that they have goals in place to try to do that, but I don't know of anyone else that is able to do that. There are companies that are trying to do things. Patagonia is a great example in the apparel industry, because they'll even use weird materials to try to recycle, to put into their garments, because they want people to reuse them. You can take your Patagonia garment, ripped, torn, shredded, whatever, to them. They will do their best to fix it, because they don't want you to have to buy a new garment if you don't have to. And oftentimes they'll even do that at no cost, because they really want to keep that going. But they still have to buy virgin materials for some of the things they make, because a lot of their gear is performance-based gear that requires certain things.
Right. Anybody else? Good. Terry, do you have something? Go ahead.
Kind of going back, I think, so in the apparel industry, I think on the smaller scale, some companies are trying to do this cradle-to-cradle idea. They design in a way to allow the garments to be disassembled at the end of the product life, in a way that so for example, if I'm wearing something today, and part of it could be cotton, part of it would be polyester, that it's hard to recycle that specific garment. But if it's designed in a way that they can partial the materials out, so that it's easier for them to recycle, and then they can reuse the materials for designing the next product. So now on the smaller scale, some companies, some designers are trying to be more sustainable, going through that route, but it's not a larger scale, not really something that consumers are able to see and find those products easily. So that's sort of the downside, but there have been efforts going on.
Okay, great. Okay, Joe.
Maybe two parts. One, I have a pair of pants from Patagonia that I've had since I was an undergrad. I've sent them back to them 5 times, and they have repaired them and then sent them back to me.
Wow.
So if you have not tried it before, it takes a little bit of time, but it is an amazing repair and return of your garment. On the materials that can be infinitely reused, I guess I would give the same answer. I'm not aware of any materials that's the case, but an argument for things like aluminum is that it is highly recyclable, highly reusable, and that's true for many metals. And so maybe to already answer my why we need more mining statement, I think to get to a circular economy, we need to be really critically thinking about what we're consuming, and if that consumption can occur through a product that can really be wholly recycled, we need to get to the point where we can exist within a circular economy. And so I would hope that we see a flurry of increased kind of done very well, done very, very effectively mining in the next few decades, and then it kind of peters out. Because hopefully we can get to that circular economy and then we stop needing more inputs. But because that's not the way we've been thinking, I think we have work to do to get there. Great. Okay, question.
Yeah, ironically, my question was about Patagonia before the name came up. But so this is a question for Terry. I'm sure you're familiar with Patagonia and Johan Chenard. And he wrote this great book called Let My People Go Surfing. And in it, he recounted a lot of his business stories. And one of his more remarkable ones is that he forced Patagonia to switch to organic fiber, organic dyes, even though it was very costly. I think back in the 90s. And I was just wondering if you have heard about how much of an impact that had on the industry, and if there's been other companies trying to emulate him.
Thank you for the question. A lot of companies, especially the smaller companies, actually have tried to incorporate recycled materials, recycled polyester, or organic cotton into their product lines. But I remember, even though the efforts are mostly done by smaller companies, but I remember Walmart, probably more than 15 years ago, they actually rolled out a collection of organic T-shirts. And for that 1 year, and it's really soft feel and really nice product, but I haven't seen it for a while. So that just goes thinking about the company philosophy and what they are trying to do. But as we know, a lot of companies are trying to be zero waste or carbon neutral in their maybe 2030 goals or 2050 goals. But I know that Patagonia trying to incorporate the organic materials does really have an impact on what other companies so they inspire what other companies could do. But I also know, even though Patagonia in general is sort of the model company that we will talk about in our apparel field, but they also have done things that might not be so great, and they got caught, and that's in some way the companies are making mistakes, but they learn from their mistakes and continue to do better.
Okay, what were some of the mistakes? I'd like to hear what one of them was.
That was I don't remember a specific year.
Right.
Maybe about 10 years ago, they got into the use of certain materials, and then that was not fully transparent, or somehow the relationship with the suppliers was not really clear, like in terms of how the business relationship works. Okay. So I don't remember the specific, but I remember reading news about it. So they learn from the mistakes, and then they continue to kind of fix that problem. And it also is a learning experience for other companies to avoid similar mistakes in the future.
Right. Okay, so you were going to say something.
Yeah, if I can add to that, because the nature of the supply chain is that, right, the principal manufacturer has numerous suppliers upstream, sometimes many, many levels of suppliers, going all the way back to then getting to your raw materials, your mining, your raw materials. And the issue there is that it's very common in an industry like apparel, where their supply chain is very complex, for the manufacturer to not know what's going on with their suppliers, because they don't have that visibility. So that's something supply chains are working on, because of the numerous examples we've seen of different issues with child labor and poor employee practices and things like that, using materials that they weren't supposed to be using and so forth. One of the things I did want to say about Patagonia and its impact on the industry is they have impacted suppliers or potential suppliers, because a lot of companies that would love to supply materials to Patagonia, because Patagonia is so well known and such a good name, and Patagonia treats their suppliers with respect to how they pay them, when and how much and so forth, treats them really well. And so there are companies that supply to the apparel industry that would love to be a supplier to Patagonia, and they know they have to meet certain standards in order to do that. And obviously, if a company is going to change their standards, much like when Europe passed regulations in the early noughts about you can't use certain metals in electronics, so lead had to go away and all those kinds of things. Well, the suppliers that did that changed their processes across the board. They didn't just change their processes for products going to that market. So when a company starts to change processes to be better, they're going to change them across the board for all customers they work with. So that's a very positive thing.
Sue, I had a question. You said the word standard. So what did you mean, like an industry standard, or like what do you mean by standard?
No, it's company specific.
Oh, okay.
So Patagonia is going to have certain standards that their suppliers have to live to,
Okay.
and different companies will have different supplier standards depending on, it goes back to, again, their own philosophies and so forth, but a lot of companies will have our suppliers must meet these policies, otherwise we will not purchase their goods to go into our products.
Okay, Meagan. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing something similar in agriculture, where it's getting pushed back up from the consumer back to producers, especially in the realm where a lot of companies are trying to quantify their climate impacts and their greenhouse gas emissions. And so they are now asking producers, or whoever comes after the producer, so along that supply chain, to quantify their impacts. There's a bunch of different decision support tools, and that is cascading back to impact how farmers may or may not choose to grow their crops. That's also created some tension, because
Right.
farmers aren't used to being told how necessarily to
Right,
do it,
or
and they
want
aren't
to, yeah.
necessarily feeling like they have a lot of power in that process. That's
Right.
being that new layer that's being added on. But we, as a department and other colleagues, have had more companies like Ardent Mills come to us and say, how do we convince more growers to do X, Y, or Z so that our bottom line looks better from a climate perspective, for example.
All right. So Meagan, let's stick with you for a second. So I had a question about water, right? We talk about consumption, right? And ag is whatever you want to, the word you hear is 80% of water is utilized by agriculture. So what are the steps that what that industry should be taking, or that researchers should be taking, to sort of look at that huge differential? How do you address a problem like that? And particularly in the West, this is going to be enormous with the Colorado Compact coming in and everything. So I was just curious, I know you're thinking ahead, but where do you see the points that we need to sort of address there?
I have lots of opinions about this. I think we have to work at it from all fronts. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have is we get stuck in thinking of individual either commodity types or supply chains or crops that we grow, and we try to fine-tune how we grow, say, corn.
Right.
And there is a lot we can do within that. I will say that we're going to see much bigger impact if we change, not just tweaks within corn, but, for example, some of the, we were talking about, you can get subsurface drip irrigation systems, you can have precision irrigation, you can use drone imagery, you can use all these tools now to fine-tune your irrigation. However, that in some cases just means that you grow more crop and more efficiently, but actually use the same or more water in some cases. So
Right.
That's where the policy realm has to come in. And so we're seeing California has a Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We've seen within the Ogallala region, Kansas has changed state water laws to allow local communities to actually set their own defined conservation goals.
Right.
And some examples from there where they set their goals, they all agreed, okay, we're going to reduce over a 5-year period 25% of our water use. And they did it largely by switching what crops they grow which meant they had to have markets. So it's more complex than just tweaking individual crops, and that's unfortunately where we focused a lot of our research, and we need to be more holistic, I think.
Right, but do you see a thing where people will buy something that says, well, this was grown, I mean, is that, or is it mostly like, again, we look at the sort of the product, right? Like you eat free-range chicken versus Kobe beef, right?
Yeah.
Right?
How many of you have made a decision based on some data on a water footprint for the future?
I'm curious. I mean, yeah. But,
I mean, it hasn't, and they do consumer polling on this.
It's probably more important than a carbon footprint.
Or regenerative ag, those things don't poll well in the marketplace for being a draw for consumers and deciding on their labeling decisions. Organic does.
Yeah. Or natural, right?
Or non-GMO does, even when it's things that aren't even available as GMO crops that are labeled as non-GMO.
Right.
Yeah, so I think there is some potential in the future, and there's rating systems that are being developed, and consumers haven't bought into it yet.
Great question.
Hi, my name is Heidi Pruis. I work for Larimer County as the Climate and Sustainability Manager. And so my question for all of you is around bringing it down to a local perspective. When we're trying to communicate to us as residents here, like what is it that we can do every day, it comes to be very difficult to know where do I start my overconsumption journey to become not so overconsumptive. From a local government perspective, it's, we think about landfills. We think about maybe our purchasing policy. We could get a little bit there, but it's the communication out to the community and how we want to act together that changes behavior that helps us get at those intangibles that we haven't really gotten to yet. So what is your thought around local programs, local policy?
Anybody want to jump on that first? Go ahead. Terry?
So I think going back to overconsumption of clothing, one thing about overconsumption of clothing is it often is the cause of overconsumption of energy and water because how the clothing is taken care of. So if we think about sustainable laundry, like how many of you will wash your jeans after one wear? Or on average, I know the research found that about half, like 50% of female consumers will actually wash their jeans after 1 to 2 wears, when in fact you can wash probably after 6 wears on average, as long as there's no stain, it doesn't smell.
How do you keep them looking good, though? I guess you have to hang them up and stuff like that? Is that what you don't throw them on the floor?
Yeah, I usually just hang dry. And some of my colleagues, they actually put the jeans in the freezer because it can prevent the bacteria growing. So that is one way. But so that's just one statistic. The other statistic that I found is, especially in America, consumers tend to wash clothes regularly because about a quarter of consumers think that if they wear something that without being washed the second time, then they will leave a bad impression to people. So they like to wash and stay clean, and that's why a lot of people overwash their clothing. So I think if we can kind of communicate with residents how often they should wash their clothing, and it really depends on the different type of clothing. Of course, underwear we should wash regularly, wash after one wear. But there are like suits and certain type of products that you don't have to wash regularly after one wear, and that's something that education can come in. And when you Google, there are a lot of different sources to tell you, with cotton products, how often do you wear? With your yoga pants wear, how often should you wear? So that's something that if you, I think it's a behavior thing that we can change, is if we communicate that tips to consumers, it can reduce the energy of water consumption, it can reduce the consumption of energy overall.
Yeah, I think teenage boys should watch it every day. I mean, that's my experience. So anyway, go ahead, Meagan. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
With my 10-year-old, I disagree. I think, one thing I think the city does really well, from my perspective, it's really effective, is I get my water bill and it tells me how I compare to my, it's a competition. Like, how am I doing? And we've actually tried that a little bit in ag. We've started doing some competitions, so farmers can their management practices against others in sort of an experiment station ground, so not necessarily their own. And it's actually fostered a lot more engagement than just, say, an extension program that says you should do this versus that. So I think the city is doing some smart things and understanding what might drive changes in behavior.
The STAR program has done that. It's gotten farmers to compare, you're 5-star, you're only a 3-star, what are you doing? You know, that kind of stuff. So they are talking to each other. Yeah, Joe.
Well, maybe more to the communication of how we're part of a broader system, and that decisions related to individual consumption are so tied towards different factors within those systems, like the drive for electric cars, when, you know, instead we should be moving towards more public transport and more bikes or electric bikes. And, right. So communicating that there's this much larger impact beyond what's happening to us locally. And on water, we might have the water locally, you know, but that's part of the Colorado River Compact, right. and a huge system that's very impactful. We do some work on earthen ditches and looking at ways to reduce seepage from earthen ditches, which is supplying water out to agriculture, and not something we often think about, although when you walk around Fort Collins, you see these things crisscrossing the entirety of the city. 30 to 70% of the water that's flowing in those is seeping into the ground. Mm-hmm. And so on the one hand, you can look at it as, oh, well, that's eventually going to make it back to the river. That's great. But it's also mobilizing contaminants that we're adding to our lawns. A lot of it's being lost to evapotranspiration. And so we are just components in these big complex systems, and we need to try to better communicate how impactful our decisions are. Maybe a mine in Larimer County too, which would, at first blush, you think of as, you know, this is a terrible idea. But if you want to really ensure that things are being done well and being done responsibly, you need to make sure that there's oversight and it's happening in an environment where we can ensure that we're not relying on child labor, that we can ensure that we're not just going through motions in an unregulated system instead of actually sustainably producing something and managing our waste because it's going to be there forever. So maybe some of the NIMBYism too comes into play.
How many mines we have in Larimer County? Do we have? I mean,
we have aggregate mines.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. That makes sense. Yeah.
I think that's kind of the extent of it.
Yeah, but that's still a good example, though, right?
Yeah. I mean, we use the concrete and the other products that are being made out of that. And then what becomes really interesting is with all the pushback you get against those projects, often you'll get projects that might not be in the best location or done in the most sensible, sustainable way because it was the way that they could get permitted. And so what's that balance of maybe I don't want this aggregate mine next door, but this is really the right place that it should be. How do you communicate that?
Right. Susan.
Along with what everybody else has said about the communication, potentially using competition and letting people know that they're part of a larger system, the education of consumers is hugely important. So many don't understand some of the things we're talking about today, as well as the huge scope of things. So communicating some of the statistics, some of the issues, some of the negative impacts. And studies show, there's research that shows, so based on like healthcare issues and so forth, marketing studies will take a look at what is better for communication of certain issues, positive framing or negative framing. So you should go get tested because influenza is really dangerous if you're a college student and you can spread that. That's a positively framed message. Students ignore that. If you say, this could kill you, so you should get tested, all of a sudden they're at least listening. So they might actually do it. So studies have shown that for certain aspects, negatively framed messages make people listen more. And if they're going to listen, then maybe they'll start to get more information and take action. So determining which messaging or what kind of statistics should go out to tell people, look, this is what's happening if we as a whole larger system don't make some changes, we could see these kinds of impacts. And I know there are some general statistics out there of by this year, but individuals don't necessarily, right? We think that, oh, but everybody else is doing that. My practices aren't actually impacting that. So taking it at the global level, but bringing it to local communications to know that, yes, if you did this one thing, this would make a change.
Right. Peter, we had just scared everybody last Saturday, right? We had all those emails and everybody saying, boy, the message was horrible, but Peter and I scared all these Lutheran ministers over the Saturday. And they all wrote us letters saying, well, it was a really bad message, but that was great. Anyway, so, there you go. Sorry, your name.
Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Stewart. I work in public health, and kind of tagging off of the previous question and going off of what you all just shared, how would you go about strategically as a collective impact, knowing that this field and what you all are doing also ties in with other fields across, the whole spectrum, and just understanding that, we're equity and there's barriers, and knowing that there's consistently just a bunch of different populations of folks and where people are at. How would you go about strategically messaging and meeting people where they're at, while also trying to prioritize the sustainability side of it, but also knowing that these people might not be able to prioritize it in their own lives?
Okay, Joe.
A very hard question. Maybe how I would go about it is that we need diverse teams, both in terms of perspective and in terms of disciplinary knowledge. So we started a center related to mine waste with Colorado School of Mines. Colorado School of Mines has not cared the slightest about mine waste until a few years ago. And it's fascinating to look at how much the mining practices impact the waste. And mining has been thinking about what is the sociocultural, the environmental impact of some of their actions, but not of that holistically. And so bringing in teams that include sociologists and anthropologists and communication specialists and others into those conversations is really fundamentally necessary, because me as an engineer is not going to get that right. I'm not going to message it right. But if we can have a team that is educating each other and communicating and trusting each other, we're going to be much more effective. And so fostering conditions where we have big teams communicating is how we're trying to approach it. It's just not the quickest and not the easiest.
Great. Meagan, what about agriculture? You have the same issue, right?
Yeah. One thing I always... I understand why, but I also don't understand why, so the Farm Bill, for example, largest piece of legislation that brings funding to agriculture, also has all of the, the food safety, the food programs for low-income communities. And those two are so completely disconnected, and so and I think it comes back to this whole concept of externalities that we still struggle with trying to find ways to quantify the public health impacts of, say, our manufacturing or our agricultural production practices. And if we actually integrated that into the cost of production, it would change probably a lot about what we produce. If we actually thought about producing food that would actually provide a healthy diet for people, obviously we can't do that we've specialized everything into these different areas, we think for really good reasons, but for efficiency, but there's externalities to that. So I don't have an answer to it. It's incredibly complex, but the reality is we know that more diverse diets lead to better public health outcomes. And so if we connect those two dots and had more diverse agricultural systems, it would actually support some smaller systems, which would reduce some barriers for more diverse people coming in and becoming part of the landscape of farming, which is largely not the case anymore.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, I have a question back here from our director. One more. Oh, over here. I'm sorry. Who has a question? Who? Oh, Terry, you had a comment? I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's fine. Thank you. Kind of just following, I know that I don't know if you agree with me, but I think being sustainable is a very long journey, and it's not easy, because you have to think about how I will recycle things. You have to think about, do I really need this? You need to be very mindful, and being mindful takes a lot of energy. But once you practice, you continue to practice, and eventually you get it, it becomes habitual, then it becomes easier. So I think maybe the message is not so much, just one step at a time, I guess. That's what I usually tell students and tell people, even my husband. Like, you don't have to recycle everything, but at least if you remember to recycle this, if you remember to do this, and that would be great. It's better than not doing anything at all.
Right.
So I think having that mindset set, and depending on what you can do, if you cannot do everything sustainable, but at least try to decide on one thing that you can do sustainable, maybe buy organic food if that's what you care about in terms of health, or if buying sustainable clothing if you have a little bit of that budget, or if or even buying less clothing, not overconsume. That's another way to be sustainable. Just think about what is most important to you personally, and then try to stay focused in the area. I think at least that's one step at a time.
Buy organic once in a while, right?
Right. We are not saying that you have to buy everything organic, but when you can, at least buy one organic versus
local.
Local and organic.
Right.
So maybe talking about like fast fashion, going back to the fast fashion and overconsumption, we tell students, instead, I know you like fashion styles, I know being trendy is important to you, but instead of buying 100 items that are fast fashion, can you buy 80? And then 20 of those items could be more good quality, better brands, and that will last longer. So kind of shifting the budget a little bit, and still they could be a little more sustainable, even though it's not 100%.
Do they have that labeling in clothing? I mean, I guess I'm really concerned now because I don't really shop that much, but I would like to know, like, do they label them? Like, does it say, I mean, how do you do that? Like, if something looks good, That's a really good question. A lot of times you can tell by the price. So if you go to Forever 21, go to Shein.com, a dress is like $20, or sometimes it's $5. Then you can tell that it's probably not very sustainably made. Right.
They probably explore the labor, and by paying them really cheap wages.
Right.
So a lot of times, but not a lot of consumers do that. About half to maybe 2/3 of consumers might look at the care label to see what the product is made of.
Right.
So whether it's recycled or cotton, or like buying natural fiber is also better than buying like the artificial fabrics, synthetic fabrics. Yeah.
Okay. Diana has Dr. Wall, our director.
Yes. Hi again, hi. My name is Diana Wall, and I'm the director of the school, and I appreciate everybody being here on a cold day for us. My question is maybe at the macro scale. As I look and think about what we're talking about here, we're talking about agriculture, we're talking about extractive things, and making new chemicals, or getting chemicals and dyes that affect the environment. And so I have no idea, for example, either in Colorado or I've been to the Amazon. I was talking to Joe earlier. I've been to the Amazon and seen huge mines there. The footprint of a mine is just tremendous. And I'm just looking at this and thinking, we want more and we want more. And there's a disconnect, I think, on mining to what am I wearing that might have come from a mine, the copper that you were mentioning or something like that. But the huge footprint, is that even a concern, or is it just that we start to focus people for both agriculture and mining? Do we focus more and more and more and get people to think locally, and we may not have all the food we are now used to getting globally? Just keep narrowing down and focusing on what's happening in Fort Collins and in Colorado. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but I just keep thinking of the land area, the depth of some of these activities and their impact.
Yeah.
On the mining side, I think there's definitely an aspect of, if it's more local, you're more aware, more cognizant of what's happening. If you haven't been to Brazil and seen the huge iron ore mines, you don't have any sense of the tremendous scale of what's being done, that they're building 1,000-foot-high dams out of sand to hold back, literal hundreds of square miles of material that has the consistency of, the muck at the bottom of a lake. And it's not like a water reservoir where if there's a problem with the dam, you pump the water out and you repair it. that material's there, and it's going to be there for a very long time. So without having that as something that we experience, that we see, there's just an inherent disconnect. And we see that in our students, our civil and environmental engineering undergrads. Many of them will talk about mining for the first time when they're juniors, and they'll say, we still mine? That still happens?
Wow.
And you know, that's horrifying, but it's also they're missing a piece of the conversation and they haven't experienced it. On the huge scale and the huge impact, the other piece is perhaps that what mining, as an example, has done, or how mining occurred 100 years ago, thinking of like the Berkeley pit in Montana, is not the same as how we can, if we choose to, manage mine waste today.
Right.
You know, I wouldn't trust flying in a plane 100 years ago. They've evolved. And so the same is true in how we manage those wastes. And we can today, if we care to do so, if we do so in environments where there's a forcing function to do so, you restore as we go along. We can rebuild the landscape. We can work with local communities and environmentalists to try to figure out what is the land use that we want to come out, and only have a little piece that's open and exposed at any given time, and then try to recreate a stable landform. But the driver just isn't there in many locations. And so until we're able to take more ownership for that, yeah, we're going to have huge impacts.
Is most of the mine, I mean, I kind of know the answer to this, but like, so is most of the mining done overseas? I mean, it seems like I remember hearing someplace like the United States was great at developing the technology for mining in terms of the engineering aspects of it and even the environmental aspects of it. But where is all that being done now? Are we still?
Yeah, I mean, very, very largely overseas.
Right.
And what's really interesting is a lot of the mining engineering, the mine waste management is done by folks out of the United States. They're just working internationally.
Right.
So Denver is a huge hub for mining,
Right.
mine waste management. The vast majority of the work is not done in the U.S.
Wow, it's amazing. Question, we got two questions, one here and then we'll go there. Here we go.
Hi, thanks for being here. My name's Nancy York and I'm a native of Fort Collins. I live in my family home of 80-some years. And it is full of objects that I don't even know what they're good for. So, but I'm very interested in the art of repair, be it a mining or especially clothing. And the other thing that I'm quite interested in is leading by example. And I see our government, that is especially good for the government. I think we'd be much further along regarding climate change if our government would lead by example.
Right on. Anyway, anybody want to comment about that? Right on.
Yeah, I think especially, you know, for those of us at the university as an example, if we're not doing what we're speaking to, if we're not, you know, if I'm going to make a conversation about vehicles versus bikes and I'm not willing to ride my bike places, I'm doing a pretty poor job. And so we need to be responsible for that. We need to encourage others to be responsible for that. Absolutely.
That's great. Sue.
I want to share just a quick story with you because I love that comment, and we do need to do that. We need to lead by example, and we need to get into that mindset of I don't need another new object. I probably have one that maybe it even still works. We just don't know if it works. I had a student in a sustainable supply chain class, and this young man was very enterprising, and he showed up with different shirts to class every day. And they were multicolored and so forth. He literally would take clothing from friends and so forth, and he'd take this sleeve off that shirt and this front off that, and he would build his own shirts. So he never shopped for shirts. He would literally just get clothing from other people that didn't want it anymore, and he would make his own. And it was when he communicated, everyone was fascinated by that and said, this is really cool. So then they started going to him and saying, will you make me a shirt? And right, and this is because we have an entrepreneurial mindset in the United States, and because we went through the pandemic and so many people decided, I don't want to do that job anymore. I want to be my own boss. I want to come up with my own business. If people start more businesses like that, like I'm going to repair these kinds of electronics because I know how to do it, or I'm going to make my own clothes, that would be fantastic, because then and it would be local, and we'd have some local great businesses instead of having to go buy the new clothes and all the new things, all the gadgets we have.
Yeah, like nobody fixes vacuum cleaners anymore. You go bring a vacuum in, they'll say, oh, we can't fix that. So then you go buy a $70 vacuum.
Or, and the story of stuff points this out, that
Yeah.
if you have a piece of electronic equipment and you want to get it fixed, they'll basically tell you it'll cost you $100, but if you buy a new one, it's $50.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Megan, you want to say
No,
something?
I'm just saying, then that frustrates them when you're like, no, still fix it.
Yeah. That's the way to go. Yeah, I want it fixed. Yeah, anyway. Where's the question? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I left over here. Sorry about that.
Hi, I'm Taylor Palman. I write for the Rocky Mountain Collegian at CSU. And I am curious, you talked earlier about like the company philosophies. I wonder how that might transcribe to like policymaking in the government, and how those higher people can be that influence, and if they need to do that negative kind of marketing to the overall, as this big scale, as you talk about us as a whole, like as a country, as a world, how might you hope the government tries to help sustainability moving forward and such like that?
I'll talk
Meagan,
about one
go, yeah.
example that definitely caused quite a buzz. I don't know what the long-term impact will be, but the Federal Reserve required that banks, FDIC insured banks, take climate risk into account more recently. And for us in the water space, in the ag space, bank lenders were one of the more difficult people in engaging in sustainability, because this year's profitability was always, the forefront. And so some of these conservation practices that might not maximize productivity every single year actually compromised farmers' abilities to get their operating loans. And so having that climate risk piece in there was a bit of a door opening. I don't know honestly how big of an impact it's going to have, but to at least encourage the lenders to think longer term.
Wow, that's good.
I don't know if in any other fields if that had an impact.
Joe.
Yes, large impact on the mining space. And, maybe the other one is there's been really big tailings failures over the last few years. And so that coupled with climate change and kind of, I think mining has seen this opportunity to not be as much the evil industry. And that it's not them, it's those awful carbon emitters. And so it's created this translational opportunity where they can move in a direction that is more sustainable. And so on the mine waste side, the ICMM, which is a group of the biggest mining companies, has pushed forward a global industry standard on tailings management that they've accepted and is tied to many aspects of how we're stewarding waste. And now they're trying to encourage that adoption at government levels across the world, because they see the sustainability opportunity, but they realize it needs to be across all of the industry, not just some major companies. And there's certainly business reasons at play there. But as that opportunity for value and for expansion exists, they're moving in it, and so they're pushing through their lobbyists, through government, to do the same. So absolutely.
Okay. Any other comments? Go ahead, Terry, and then I'll get to Peter. Yeah, go ahead.
So on the textile side, I have wanted to see a textile recycling program in the city or in the state for a long time, but it's not happening, and it's probably not going to happen for a while, probably because of the infrastructures. When we have so many recycled garments from every household, we need companies to manage all those waste, but so far in the state, not a lot of the textile recyclers actually are in business operation. And also to manage that large quantity of the textile waste from households could be a challenging task, because a lot of because eventually if they can recycle whatever, for example, shrink the cotton and make it into a seat belt or whatever the seat cover in the cars, but a lot of those recycled textile waste will still kind of go into landfill. So having the recycling program could be the first point, but we still need to be able to build up that infrastructure to be able to move the waste throughout the kind of the downstream of the supply chain.
So I think this one is a little more for Meagan, probably Peter Bachland again here. All of you have talked quite a bit about economic signals affecting both consumption and waste and things like that. And it seems to me that in agriculture, I was sitting here mulling this over, and agriculture is a little more complicated in some ways, because on the one hand, you have this problem, significant human suffering around lack of access to food and hunger. So you have suffering from hunger. On the other side of the ledger, you have major human suffering associated with literal overconsumption, like overeating and obesity. And then in the middle, you have the vast majority of people in the US that amazingly waste 30 to 40% of their food. And so are we making any progress in really understanding the dynamic around food waste? And is it, at the bottom line, really a matter of economics and just the fact that food is too cheap? Is that the problem? Why do people waste so much food in the advanced world, leaving aside the issues of waste in the developing world, which are different?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we have a reporter here, Dr. Schipanski, so just be careful. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, it's correct. In particularly countries like the US, our food waste is post-consumer or retail. There are, I have a friend who works in the space, and I wish I knew the details more at the top of my head, but they actually had a food waste summit recently that was sort of at national levels. They're trying to address, there are companies, this was actually someone who used to work for one of those companies that you can get your meal from, in a box on your doorstep. And watching how they tried actually to manage their waste stream by portioning. And it's interesting to see dining halls today versus when I was a student. The portioning is largely about waste. Honestly, it's health, but it's also about waste. So I think we're making steps in some of those directions. But yes, there's very little economic incentive, I think, to a large extent, especially in the restaurant retail where people want unblemished and fresh. And, there are some now more secondhand grocery stores and things where you can get, and there are some, I think, really important initiatives growing to reuse what other people won't for other things. But economics is a big piece of that.
I'm just baffled looking, personally at just how much food in the refrigerator at home is actually not going to get eaten. It's going to get composted.
Yeah.
Just because we buy too much.
Yeah, and we were talking about this. I've worked in Africa a bunch, and you can be waiting on a plane to come back to, say, the U.S., and you get delayed 8 to 10 hours, and any plane that has food on it that's not refrigerated gets dumped. They just take the plane and go, we're not going to take off in 12 hours, we got to dump it, and they dump it. Right?
Or as a college student, you eat the free sandwich.
Well, of course, right?
Food poisoning for the next day. But,
right.
Yeah. What was I going to say related to that? What was the first part of that point?
Oh, which one, mine? Or
before I was remembering my food poisoning episode.
Oh, no, I was just talking about the amount of food that, in terms of that's like, it's just sort of, there's so much wasted that we can't comprehend how much is wasted. We don't even know.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's off farm, really. Not even at the farm anymore. It's like in the transportation realm, right? Yeah.
Right, and a refrigeration.
Yeah.
I had another point, but it's
okay, you can go back to it. Anybody? Sue, you were going to say something, weren't you? You sure? Okay. All right.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, go.
I think it's part of our busy lifestyles that actually really contribute to the food waste that we have. I think we all have very good intention buying fresh vegetables and meat, and we wanted to cook on the regular basis, but we all get busy. Like students get busy, we get busy too. So instead of cooking at home, we go out to eat with friends, or instead of cooking, I'm too tired, let's just order something. So then we have this perfect food in the drawer for a week, and then eventually they just kind of become moldy or they rot.
Right.
So I think a big part of it is our lifestyle. So I think, again, going back to kind of being mindful, kind of plan in advance. Can I cook for how many days a week, and then what am I going to cook? I think that's a big part of trying to not buy and over-consume.
Meagan, go
I
ahead.
remembered now what I was going to talk
Okay,
about.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I spent a sabbatical in Spain last year and lived in an apartment. They were all amazed that we lived in single-family homes, here. And the size of my refrigerator was tiny.
Right.
And I had a market literally half a block. And so I would shop for that. I loved it too, because they ate dinner at like 8, 9 o'clock. So I'd get home and then I'd go think about what I was going to eat, and I'd buy just enough for that night. So it's also, there's cultural, the fact we go to Costco.
Right.
And stock up for a month is part of it.
Well, the same thing with washers and dryers, right? Like I was on sabbatical in France, and your washer, you could put 2 shirts in there or whatever. No, you hang it out over the balcony. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cultural norms.
Good. Okay, I have one question. So maybe just each of you quickly, if there was one thing in your discipline that you think is sort of the biggest lever, right, that could be changed, whether it's the mindset, policy, or something, what would it be? Like in the transportation, this idea, what would the biggest thing be? Like to just change, and let's go down each one. Then I have one more question for Joe, so nobody can leave yet. So go ahead.
In managing the supply chain, the biggest issue is transportation.
Right.
We spend a tremendous amount of money, and like when Terry talked about the fast fashion and some of those apparel items being $5, $10, $20, that doesn't cover what it costs to transport it here from where it was made. Right. So somebody's losing money, right? And it's probably the actual producer because they're poor labor practices or whatever. But the transportation is really expensive, and it's gotten more expensive because of the delays in the supply chain.
Right.
We used to be able to, prior to the pandemic, send an entire container on a ship from Asia for $3,000 to $4,000. And as of the beginning of this year, it's $17,000 to $19,000 for the same container now.
That's amazing. Yeah.
So huge increases in transport. And all of the modes of transport, now some are more sustainable. Putting stuff on rail is much more sustainable because they use less diesel. They have better engines, better technology in that, and you can transport a whole heck of a lot on a train. You may have to wait on Mason Street for 15 minutes for that train to go by.
Right.
However, just know when you're looking at it now that, hey, that's a good way for stuff to transport.
Right.
I'm happy to sit here, turn your car engine off while you're doing it.
I think that's great.
But a train can carry 300 to 400 trucks worth of freight.
Right.
We transport a tremendous amount of stuff here via truck, and truck eats a lot of diesel.
Right. And there's lots of rails around that don't seem to, is that true or not?
The issue with the rail companies themselves have to pay for the track, for the maintenance and putting in the track, and it's literally $1 billion a mile.
Oh, jeez.
To put in new track, which is why you don't see new track going in, because they don't want to pay that. It's too expensive. They have to get the land, et cetera. So we will continue to use these other modes of transport, but we need alternative fuels. We're talking about, the automated driving of trucks, because if we regulate the driving of the truck, they'll be more fuel efficient. Of course, that scares people. You don't want to be driving down I-25 and look and see a truck next to you and no driver in it.
Right.
But we need to explore technology and transportation, because that's the one thing in the supply chain that really needs to be fixed.
Okay, Joe.
That's going to be a big ask, though. My first apartment in Fort Collins was right on Mason Street, and I think I'm still scarred by the train, so I will try. On the mining side, maybe just to focus on that, I'm tempted to say labor, because we need many, many more folks to work on mine waste, because they haven't historically, those positions haven't existed, and they do now. But I think I'll actually, to the transportation point, say what we really need is more mining in the U.S. that's local, that's not requiring us to transport commodities all over the world, that's not enabling really, really heavy stuff, that's not potentially enabling practices that are going to be tremendously impactful to communities and the environment, and that are going to reduce prices and availability for technology to divest from carbon.
Right. Okay, great. Meagan?
I'm going to do a bit of a cop-out, which is that agriculture, I think our biggest challenge has been always looking for the single lever or the silver bullet. And I think we need to be more humble and realize it's many levers.
Good.
And that's something I emphasize to my students a lot. If they think they're going to produce their way out of global food insecurity, they're flat wrong. That so much of it is social and economic issues and distribution. We produce enough calories to feed everyone already. It's how we produce and where, and so if we can get away from the overproduction mindset, I think we'll be better on conservation.
All right, the old wicked problem, right? Okay, and Terry.
So I guess kind of from an overconsumption perspective of clothing, I would suggest to buy better, buy less, and also buy secondhand if you can. I just looking around, I feel like I think we're okay buying secondhand if you want to buy several secondhands. But recently, I was just talking to students and realized a lot of the younger generation, especially because of COVID, they would go to secondhand shops and buy 100 items, for example, and then they try to resell. So I think buying less, buying better, buying secondhand is good, but there's always a limit about how much you buy and how much you need for your own personal use. So just have this mindset about, do I really need this much? And think about, if I buy this, where would it all end up eventually? And can it be biodegradable, or can I find another home for this product to be reused? So that's kind of really keep that in mind when you decide to buy something new, not just clothing or maybe another gadget. I think that would be helpful to be more sustainable.
That was great. You guys were great. This was really a good panel. You guys did great work. Joe, I have one question for you. Okay. You mentioned electric cars versus electric bikes, and I have to go to my book club tonight. So could you give me the difference between the two? I want to know. I'm going to wail on this one, guys. So is it, what's the big difference between an electric car and an electric bicycle? Like the carbon footprint, or just the materials?
You're instead of transporting with you literally hundreds, thousands of pounds of material, you're transporting with you maybe 50 pounds.
Okay.
And so the energy consumption, the inputs to that, those are all going to be.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. You convinced me. Now I'm getting a bike. The car's gone.
Cheaper to charge.
Right. Great. Okay.
Get a few at Costco.
Okay. Anyway, hey, let's give them a round of applause. That was great. Anyway, so thanks again, guys. You guys did an awesome job. It went really well. Thank you for the questions from the audience. And we'll see you at our next panel. And everybody ride your bikes home. Well, the weather's not, but anyway, be safe going home. Okay, thank you.